In the year 1194, the town of Chartres, France, caught fire. Most of the city burned. Homes were destroyed, streets disappeared into smoke. And for a moment, people believed the cathedral at the center of the town had been lost forever. But 3 days later, when the smoke finally cleared, something unexpected changed everything. Inside the ruins, the townspeople found a relic that had survived the fire completely untouched. It was a piece of cloth believed to have belonged to the Virgin Mary. Not burned, not damaged, not even scorched. Medieval chroniclers described what happened next in very clear terms. The reaction wasn't divided. It wasn't debated. It was unanimous. They believed this survival wasn't random. It wasn't luck. It was a message. Not just a religious message, but a mandate. Build something worthy of what had been preserved. And what they built afterward became one of the most extraordinary structures in medieval Europe. A building so precisely engineered that even today, modern scientists still struggle to fully explain how it works the way it does. Not spiritually, physiologically. And when I finally started to understand what was happening inside that building, I realized the explanation had almost nothing to do with religion at all. I didn't arrive at this idea the way most historians do. It actually started with a conversation. A friend of mine is an iologist, someone who studies how sound interacts with the human body. One afternoon, she mentioned something casually, almost as an aside. She said certain very old stone buildings produce acoustic frequencies that modern concert halls are deliberately designed to imitate. Frequencies that can measurably change heart rate, breathing, even brainwave patterns. So I asked her a simple question. Which buildings? She named 4. 3 of them were Gothic cathedrals. The 4th was a Neolithic stone circle in Scotland. That answer stayed with me, because those structures were built thousands of years apart. Different cultures, different technologies, different purposes, or at least what we're told were different purposes. So I spent the next 8 months trying to understand what connected them. And what I eventually found wasn't mysticism. It was engineering. And once I understood the engineering, I started to understand something else too. Why the version of history most of us learned barely mentions it. Let's start with the word cathedral itself. The word comes from the Latin cathedra, which means seat or chair. Specifically, it refers to the bishop's chair, the official seat of authority within a diocese. That's the explanation we're usually given. And it's true. But it's not the whole story, because the official historical narrative tells us cathedrals were built as expressions of devotion, as houses of worship, as monuments to faith. And yes, they absolutely were those things. But they were also something else entirely. Something the official story almost never talks about. They were hospitals, not symbolically, literally. The word itself contains a clue most people walk past without noticing. The Latin root cath traces back to the Greek katharos, meaning to cleanse or purify. It's the same root that gives us the word catharsis, the emotional release Aristotle described when people watched tragedy in ancient theater. In the ancient world, purification of the body and purification of the mind were not separate ideas the way they are today. They were the same process, and they were achieved through the same methods. Now think about the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe: Chartres, Notre Dame, Cologne, Canterbury, Salisbury. These buildings weren't constructed by individual artists working alone. They were built by guilds, organized groups of craftsmen who carried technical knowledge that has only partially survived into the modern era. Knowledge about geometry, knowledge about acoustics, knowledge about how colored light behaves when it passes through specific mineral pigments, and knowledge about how all of those elements working together could produce measurable effects inside the human nervous system. The stonemasons who built these cathedrals were called Freemasons. The usual explanation is that they were free because they worked with free stone, a type of fine-grained limestone or sandstone that could be cut precisely in any direction, unlike rougher rubble stone used in simpler construction. That explanation is correct. But it's incomplete, because the freedom in that name meant something else too. These builders moved from city to city, from kingdom to kingdom. They carried their technical knowledge with them, and they weren't permanently tied to any single lord, bishop, or political authority. That mobility mattered. The craft guilds of medieval Europe operated inside a system of knowledge transfer unlike anything we have today. 7-year apprenticeships, strict building standards, carefully controlled pricing structures, and most importantly, a body of technical understanding passed directly from person to person across generations, knowledge that was rarely written down. It lived inside the guild, and when modern acoustic researchers finally started studying these buildings seriously, something unexpected appeared in the data. This is where the official story and the physical evidence start to move in different directions. Take Chartres Cathedral as an example. Inside that building, the reverberation time, the amount of time it takes for sound to decay by 60 decibels after the source stops, is about 5 seconds. That by itself isn't unusual. Large stone buildings often behave that way. What is unusual is how that reverberation is distributed across frequencies. Chartres doesn't amplify sound evenly. Instead, it strengthens a very specific range, between 40 and 60 hertz. That's an extremely low frequency band, below the range of most musical instruments. It's something you feel more than you hear. And according to neuroscience research published over the last 2 decades, that exact frequency range is associated with the theta state of brain activity, a state connected to deep relaxation, lower cortisol production, and in clinical environments, measurable pain reduction. In other words, the building wasn't just beautiful. It was affecting the neurochemistry of the people inside it, whether they understood it consciously or not. And that raises a question historians don't usually ask. Was that effect accidental, or was it intentional? One of the researchers who has spent years trying to answer that exact question is Dr. Rupert Till at the University of Huddersfield. For more than a decade, he has studied the acoustics of ancient and medieval structures, not from a symbolic perspective, but from a physical one. His work focuses on what these buildings actually do to sound once it enters them. And what he found is difficult to ignore. When Dr. Till studied Stonehenge, he discovered that the original configuration of the stones likely produced standing waves, patterns of sound reflection that created a strange, disorienting auditory environment. He described the effect as confusing and immersive, something ancient visitors would almost certainly have interpreted as sacred or transformative. But what's more interesting is what happened when researchers began studying Gothic cathedrals the same way. They found similar patterns, similar acoustic behavior, similar evidence of intentional shaping of sound inside the structure itself. Take the flying buttress, for example. Every architecture student learns about flying buttresses as a structural solution. They allowed medieval builders to construct thinner walls and larger windows without the roof collapsing inward. That's the standard explanation. And again, it's correct. But it's incomplete. Because those same buttresses also function as acoustic deflectors. They redirect sound energy back into the interior space, instead of allowing it to dissipate outward through the walls. In other words, they help trap sound inside the cathedral in very specific ways. Ways that shape how those low-frequency waves behave. Ways that reinforce the exact frequency ranges researchers now associate with measurable physiological responses in the human body. This wasn't random. Medieval builders didn't have oscilloscopes. They didn't have frequency analyzers. They didn't have neuroscience. But they did have something just as powerful. Observation. Generations of builders watching how people reacted inside different stone spaces. Watching how sound moved through arches. Watching how voices carried through long halls. Watching how certain proportions changed the feeling of being inside a structure. And over centuries, they refined what worked. That knowledge didn't live in books. It lived inside the guild. And this is where the story starts to become uncomfortable. Because something happened in the 16th century that changed everything. Between 1536 and 1541, King Henry VIII carried out what history calls the dissolution of the monasteries in England. Most textbooks describe this as a religious and political event. And it absolutely was. But it was also something else. It was an economic transformation on a scale that's hard to fully grasp today. Henry seized somewhere between a quarter and a third of all land in England. Entire religious communities disappeared almost overnight. And with them, something else disappeared too. The infrastructure that supported them. The craft guild networks, the hospices, the almshouses, the systems of care that had supported the sick and the poor for centuries. The historian Eamon Duffy documented what this actually meant on the ground. In 1530, England had around 500 religious hospitals. By 1550, fewer than 50 remained. In just 20 years, about 90% of the country's existing medical infrastructure vanished. That statistic changes how we understand what monasteries and cathedrals actually were. Because they weren't only religious centers, they were medical centers. The surviving records, though many were deliberately destroyed or simply allowed to decay, describe herbal gardens containing hundreds of medicinal plant species, dormitories where the sick were housed, water systems designed for sanitation, dietary practices refined through generations of observation. And at the center of these complexes, almost always, stood the cathedral itself. The building where sound, light, geometry, and ritual came together in ways that produced measurable changes inside the human body. The stained glass alone deserves serious attention here. The standard explanation is that stained glass functioned as visual storytelling for a largely illiterate population. And that's true. But it wasn't the only function. Modern material science has shown that the mineral pigments used in medieval stained glass changed the spectrum of light entering the building. The red glass, produced with copper oxide, transmits wavelengths associated with serotonin activity. The blue glass, produced with cobalt, transmits wavelengths linked to melatonin regulation. Today we know this because we have spectrometers. Medieval glaziers didn't have those tools. But they had something else. Generations of watching how people responded to colored light inside these spaces. They refined their methods based on what they observed. And this pattern appears again and again. Sound, light, geometry, even smell, all working together. Take incense, for example. There's a Bulgarian chemist named Ion Zidarov who spent 3 decades studying the chemical composition of incense used in Orthodox Christian services. In 2008, He published findings showing that burning frankincense activates a protein in the nervous system called TRPV3. Activation of that protein produces measurable anxiolytic effects, meaning it reduces anxiety, and analgesic effects, meaning it reduces pain. The church had been burning frankincense inside reverberant stone buildings for more than 1,000 years before anyone identified that protein. They didn't know about TRPV3, but they knew what happened to people inside those spaces. They had watched it happen for generations. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting medieval cathedrals were secretly pharmaceutical laboratories. Faith was real. Belief was real. Devotion was real. People absolutely understood these effects as spiritual experiences. But the physical effects themselves were also real. And the builders clearly understood them at an empirical level. Generation after generation. Which raises another uncomfortable question. If this knowledge existed, knowledge about how architecture could influence the nervous system, what happened to it? Because it didn't just fade away slowly. It disappeared during a very specific historical window, and not just in England. Across Europe, over the course of 2 centuries, the guild system itself began to collapse. In France, the Edict of Turgot in 1776 abolished the guild structure entirely, just 13 years before the French Revolution. In England, the Statute of Artificers had regulated apprenticeship systems and wage standards since 1563. By 1814, the apprenticeship clauses were gone. Then came the Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800. These laws made collective bargaining illegal for workers. One by one, the legal structures that allowed guild knowledge to exist were dismantled. And when those structures disappeared, the knowledge systems inside them disappeared too. At exactly the same time, something else was happening. The function of cathedrals began to change. The buildings themselves didn't change, but what they were for did. The monastic hospitals were gone. The guilds that understood the acoustic and optical engineering were gone. And what remained was the shell of the structure. Still standing, still beautiful, but now serving a much narrower role. By the 19th century, when historians began writing the narratives many of us still rely on today, the idea that architecture could directly affect the human nervous system sounded like superstition. These historians lived in the industrial age. They believed in machines, in factories, in wages, in measurable mechanical output. The idea that medieval builders might have understood something about human physiology that later centuries had forgotten simply didn't fit the story of progress they were trying to tell. So it disappeared from the story. Quietly. Almost completely. And once it disappeared, it became very difficult to see again. There's a question I keep coming back to. And the more I read about this period of history, the harder it becomes to ignore. Was any of this accidental? Because the same centuries that saw the collapse of the guild system also saw the rise of something entirely new, the modern patent system. The English Statute of Monopolies in 1624 is usually described as a milestone in intellectual property law. It's often presented as a progressive step forward, a way to protect inventors, a way to reward innovation. And in many ways, that's true. But it also marked something else. It marked the beginning of a legal framework that transformed knowledge itself. Before this shift, knowledge inside the guild system was collective. It was protected by tradition, transmitted through apprenticeship, and preserved through community structures that lasted generations. Afterward, knowledge increasingly became private property. Something that could be owned. Something that could be restricted. Something that could be licensed. And once knowledge starts functioning that way, the guild model becomes almost impossible to sustain. There's a small moment from American history that captures this transition perfectly. In 1817, Thomas Jefferson asked the Carpenters' Company of Philadelphia for access to their internal rule book. They refused. By that point, their refusal already sounded almost nostalgic. The legal world around them was changing quickly, and the conditions that allowed organizations like theirs to exist were disappearing. The old system of shared technical knowledge was being replaced, and with it, something else vanished too. The ability to build structures like Chartres. Think about what the builders of Chartres Cathedral actually accomplished. They constructed a structure in just 26 years that has now stood for more than 8 centuries. The nave rises 121 feet into the air. The walls are almost entirely glass, and that glass is held in place by a skeletal framework of stone ribs and flying buttresses that still function today without modern reinforcement. The building survived revolutions. It survived wars. It survived centuries of weather. And when modern engineers finally studied the stonework closely, they discovered tolerances that rivaled 20th century construction techniques. But the builders didn't have computers. They didn't have laser levels. They didn't have reinforced concrete. What they had was geometry. Geometry passed down through generations inside the guild system. Practical knowledge accumulated slowly, carefully, across centuries. And they used that knowledge to build something extraordinary. A structure that doesn't just stand. A structure that acts. Through sound, through light, through incense, through proportion, through materials chosen and placed with intention. All working together to influence the human nervous system in ways most visitors never consciously recognize. Today, we can measure the acoustic frequencies inside Chartres. We can analyze the stained glass using spectrometers. We can study the airflow patterns. We can identify the chemical effects of incense. But there's something we still can't do. We can't build another one. Not because we lack technology. In many ways, we have better tools than medieval builders ever imagined. What we don't have is the knowledge system they worked inside. We don't have the 7-year apprenticeships that preserved observation across generations. We don't have guild structures that accumulated technical understanding slowly over centuries. We don't have builders whose entire lives were spent inside the same materials, the same geometries, the same acoustic environments. That continuity is gone. And once it disappeared, something else disappeared with it. My iologist friend visited Chartres last year. She brought a portable decibel meter, a frequency analyzer. She spent about 20 minutes standing in the nave, taking measurements, watching how the sound behaved, tracking how the frequencies shifted as voices moved through the space. Then she stopped measuring. She sat down in one of the wooden chairs near the center of the cathedral and stayed there for a long time without saying anything. When she finally walked outside again, she said something very simple. Whatever they were doing, it works. That comment stayed with me because it captures something difficult to describe in technical language. Whatever the medieval builders understood, they understood it well enough to reproduce the same effects again and again across different structures, in different cities, over centuries. And that raises another question. Why do the acoustic properties of a 12th century building match what modern neurologists would design today if they were asked to create an environment optimized for stress reduction and pain relief? Why does the combination of stone geometry, colored light, incense chemistry, and reverberation time produce measurable physiological effects that align with what we now understand about the nervous system? And maybe the most difficult question of all: why was this knowledge preserved inside a guild system that governments across Europe systematically dismantled at the exact same time? Those governments were centralizing control over land, labor, and currency. Because the timing is hard to ignore. The dissolution of the monasteries, the suppression of the guilds, the restructuring of apprenticeship systems, the rise of wage labor, the creation of patent law, all happening across the same historical window. At the same time, the function of cathedrals quietly changed. The buildings themselves didn't disappear. They were still there, still standing, still beautiful. But something inside their purpose shifted. The hospitals were gone. The guild knowledge was gone. And what remained was a structure we now describe simply as a church. But if you look at the acoustic measurements, if you look at the material science, if you look at the chemical research on incense, it starts to look like something else. Something closer to a machine for healing. A machine built from stone and glass and sound and light. A machine we inherited. A machine we can measure. A machine we can study. But a machine we no longer know how to build. Because somewhere between the 16th and 19th centuries, we dismantled the people who knew how to make it.